Barrett, as I live and breathe, what a great pleasure to be with you. Um, I've always enjoyed our rapport, and I'm very much looking forward to uh, having this discussion. Really seeing what we might be able to discover, not only about the work, but also I don't know. You're such a curious fellow. You might help me to discover something about myself. Who knows?
Fantastic.
Uh, yeah.
I love it. Well, let's start with probably the most basic question you're confronted with. And that is, why eat insects? So, what reasons do you give to the reluctant, the uninitiated, when you propose the idea of consuming six-legged arthropods?
Well, I I almost hate to answer a question with a question,
Mm,
but in this case, there's no better question to answer why eat insects with why not eat insects.
the
And
very title of Vincent Holt's 1885 book, Why Not Eat Insects?
voila. And so and so, but in order, let's unpack that a little bit
Sure.
instead of being so flippant and just and so, but it is a very serious answer to a question with a question, if I may. And it's because when we look at the history and the benefits of eating insects, it's just a resounding question of like, why aren't we eating insects? So if we look at it from a historical perspective,
Mhm.
humans have been eating insects since the beginning of human evolution, and there's well documented evidences of us eating insects and continuing to eat insects throughout the history of time. So
And
one, on a historical basis, it's like, okay, we're our understanding of why eat insects, that first question that you pose, comes from an Anglo-Western viewpoint. And so we have to first be clear about who is asking the question. But two, when we take a look at, and also just to clarify, when you say six-legged insects, that's, as an entomologist, that's how you state it. But we include insects to include our eight-legged arachnid arthropod friends as well. Just as a vernacular term, we also include scorpions and spiders and the kin to also be amongst the group when we just vernacularly use the term insects, but understand that that's not the true scientific definition of what an insect is.
And generally, entomology kind of has a larger umbrella, loosely including arachnids, which are a distantly related arthropod group under Callicerata. So great, of
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for the clarification.
course.
And so when we take a further look then at the cultural sort of acceptance of eating insects, there's something that I've recognized has been a very sad reality because of globalization. And as I went to Egypt for COP27, I was in Sharm el Sheikh and Luxor, and when I went to Thailand, in Bangkok, and also when I was in Ecuador, and this is all within the past year. And I'm planning trips to Mexico, so I've been talking to a lot of people in Mexico. Um, and also with a lot of farmers that I've spoken with in Africa.
Mm.
You'll probably recognize that these are countries that are generally referred to as among the countries that are used as a statistic. 80% of the world's nations eats insects, but over 2 billion people are regularly consuming insects around the world. And they're regularly referencing Southeast Asia, Africa, and Central South America. And what I've realized, a sad realization, is that a lot of these countries now look upon the practice of eating insects with shame.
Mm.
And when I was in Thailand, and I was like, oh, I was so eager to indulge in the consumption of insects. And they're like, and when I did my deep dive and speaking to people both on the streets and at the university, Kansas University, where I worked, and amongst the AFIA, the Asian Food Feed Insect Association, the common thread and reality that I heard is, oh no, eating insects are largely for tourists and for poor people in marginalized communities in rural areas. And what I realize is that I've heard this also in different countries in Africa, in Mexico, and there's a resistance because of this globalization and desire to emulate American or European culture and the shame that they feel because of this. And so I'm very interested in one. When I was at Casasart, I challenged them and I was like, do you not want to reclaim this proud heritage of eating insects and be a leader amongst the world in what we're experiencing to be the ento revolution? Do you not want to be a leader in insect agriculture, or do you want to consider this to be in shame and let all the American and European countries make all the money and use you as a statistic? And it's provoking for people to be challenged in this way. But I'm like very serious in my desire to amplify indigenous practices, amplify indigenous voices, and also be able to let these people and the cultures reclaim this and really be proud and be able to amplify exactly what they're doing. And so we have a lot to learn. And so on a cultural side, so we talked a little bit about the history of why eat insects, and on the cultural side, we have so much to learn, and this cultural stigma that we have in our aversion towards eating insects. I think that this is something that we can look to for the ancient future, something that has we can look towards ancient practices for solutions towards the future. And when we distance ourselves from and don't look back and learn, I think that we're really just like it's something that we are losing out on for ourselves.
You bring up a an excellent point about the need for reclamation. And Julie Lesnick writes about colonialism's impact, giving entomophagy, the eating of insects, a bad name in the Western Hemisphere. And let's explore this anti-eating insect approach to discussing entomophagy, and then circle back to the reasons why. So colonialism and the stigmas attached to eating insects is one. Let's explore ethics of. So the ethics of eating other animals, big question and big issue. And then zeroing in on invertebrates, and specifically arthropods, with more and more evidence suggesting that insects and their relatives feel aversion of pain, may be sentient, and discussions of cognition and consciousness come up often and are growing in the entomology literature.
So I love that this is the first question that was asked, and we are now in subdividing this question because I haven't even gotten to fully answering why eat insects. But as you said, we'll circle back around and unpack this idea of the ethics of eating insects. And you know, I I can share a little story with you and then tackle this question because eating insects or eating food, period, eating any type of food is so personal. When we think about the practice or act of putting something in our mouth that will then be masticated and ingested and literally be inside of us, that gives us the very sustenance to survive and live, what a intimate and personal choice that we're going to make of what that is that we're going to put in our mouths. Now, I I've been working as a private chef and caterer. I started in 2011, and this has changed a lot since I started Brooklyn Bugs in 2017. But I remember where I would go to these parties, and people would have the host would have an idea of what their dietary choice, lifestyle choices. And I remember this would happen on a numerous occasions, not just on one occasion, but this one lady in particular really I recall, because she's like, Joseph, I'm a vegan, and I don't want any products that aren't vegan. And I'm like, okay, that's entirely fine, but do you want to make any considerations towards your guests and perhaps have a very vegan centric menu and maybe a few items that are not vegan for your guests that should, want something more? She's like, no, okay, maybe just one dish, and maybe we can make it like a slider, a burger, cheese slider. I'm like, okay, that this is your party, your guests. I just want to, make sure that everyone is happy with with the food that they're offered. And when we're at the party, what do I see the host doing? Eating the slider. Yeah, right. And I'm like, I thought that she's like, oh, but it's a party. I thought I would try one. And, to me, I just thought, if that's the case, why wouldn't we have offered a more comprehensive menu if you're willing to do this anyway for your guests? And sometimes there are indeed very plant-based or vegan events that require this sort of thought. And I'm a big fan of, nowadays I don't even serve any meat at any of my events except for insects. So I have a very vegetarian focused with bolstered by insect protein.
What
So
was that? And that's so exclusively arthropod.
Oh, yes. 99% of my event. I made one exception actually just recently because yeah, but that has been something I've been really staunch on. I did like a networking event, and they're like, people are paying a lot of money for this event. We need to give them at least some meat, not just insects. And so I acquiesced. However, so the point of this story is that a lot of people have an idea of what they ideally want to be, right? But not indeed in practice of what they are. And so there are a lot of people that think they want to be vegetarian or plant-based because of this idea psychologically of who they are and how they identify, while in practice it's like, oh, it's okay for me to eat a chicken. I don't judge any of that. Like, what we eat is so personal. And so I think that what I'm trying to get to is that this idea of eating insects for people, I think that whether it's for people that think, okay, I will be vegetarian because of sustainable reasons, I will be vegan because I know that I can reduce my carbon footprint more than anything else by eliminating certain or reducing my red meat and other types of meat that are really carbon intensive. And so there are a lot of people that choose to make this decision of becoming vegetarian or vegan because of this reason. And they are among the largest demographics that support the idea of eating insects because of how incredibly sustainable it is and the amount of resources it takes compared to other livestock by way of water, land, feed, greenhouse gas emissions. And so when they do the comparison, they're like, oh, okay, I can accept this as something to eat. For me, I find it really fascinating that there are a lot of people that are vegan and that have lived a vegan lifestyle for over a decade. And I'm speaking of true vegans, not people who who say it by mouth and not practice, that I personally know, that are that identify as ento-vegans,
Hmm.
people who live an entirely vegan lifestyle with the sole exception of eating insects.
Hmm.
And so I think that these are just some small examples of, like, the just the complexity of each individual's lifestyle choices. And that ultimately, I don't want to make the decision for people. And I don't want to be like, you must stop eating meat. You have, and like, I've never say, like, give, I all I try to do is provide ideas,
Mhm.
options, and the knowledge of science-based facts for people to ideally come to this sort of idea or solution on their own. Like, I don't want to, like, it's almost like I need people to come to this idea, like, oh, okay, so it's sustainable, and we should get into the nutrition, the nutrient density of it, and that it all the plus sides of it that really hit on major pillars that motivate and inspire me as the edible insect ambassador that I am.
Let's explore that complexity a bit more. So, religion plays a role in many people's lives, and religion often dictates what people allow themselves to eat. Another would be allergens. So some people are allergic to so-called shellfish, and that might extend, as FDA, the Food and Drug Administration in the US, has suggested, might extend to insects.
So on the religion side, if we look at the Old Testament or the New Testament, if we're taking the Bible as the first case study of this, they were eating locusts, and I mean, John the Baptist went out into the desert, eating just locusts and honey for 40 days. And I believe that um, that the other religions I don't have as an in-depth knowledge of with their relationship to crustaceans and or arthropods, but I do believe that some other religions, they just state that you that not to eat them uh
So,
for whatever.
as an example, you have insects that are considered kosher, right?
Right,
And
yeah. Hmm.
Muhammad talked also, presumably, about eating locusts and honey as well. So that is associated
You know,
with.
I I thought that was the case, and I was, and because of, for posterity's sake, but I was pretty sure that indeed Mohammed did, and of course the Old Testament is Judaism,
Right.
and so yeah, yeah.
I'll send you a paper from the American entomologist, the insects of in the Quran, and six insects are mentioned in the Quran, and the mention of locusts and honey being consumed.
I would love that.
Sure.
Yes.
And then on the other end of the spectrum, of course, you have Jains who would not consume any animal, for example. And so, of course, you've got all these personal choices, but those personal choices can be constrained by or dictated by people's choice of religion.
Correct. And again, I think that opens up the a broader question: are insects for everybody? And I think that answer is quite simply no. And if we take a look at the allergens that you referred to, um, that they have the same protein in their chitin as shellfish do, and so that similarity may cause an allergic reaction if you have a sensitivity to shellfish. However, I'm sure that we all know someone allergic, deathly allergic to shrimp, but
Mhm,
no other shellfish
mhm,
or mollusk
mhm.
or something. And so I think that, and I also know a very dear friend of mine, he is only allergic to mealworms, and he can eat every other insect. But when he comes to my events, I actually try, if I know that he's coming, I'll try to limit the mealworm to maybe one dish, and oftentimes there are enough variety of insects for me to pick that I don't even have to include any mealworms in the entire menu, because he's such a super fan and entomologist that I love to accommodate him if I can. Who you may know, Lou Sorkin.
Oh, of
Um,
course.
yeah, right. Yeah. So Lou is yeah, he's only allergic to
Oh,
mealworms. Um, so, but on the allergen side of things, what I find really fascinating is that in March of 2020, days before the COVID quarantine, I gave a presentation at the FDA quarterly meeting, and this story resonates for me because they just invited me back. And what really resonates for me is that at the beginning of my session, I gave my presentation right before lunch. I asked everyone, how many of you think that you're going to try eating some insect samples? And there's maybe 5 people that raise 5% of the people that raise their hand. And then I gave my presentation. We ate lunch, and I noticed some people were eating the insects. And then after lunch, when we reconvened, before we started up again, I was just like, hey, just out of curiosity, how many among you tried eating insects? 90% of the people. And so I had to get a group picture. I was just like, and I was like, you know what? I don't want the 10% of you to feel excluded. This could just be a group picture, everyone. And they're like, no, it's like, and so when I met with when I spoke with the program officer again just last week, she was like, Joseph, you're such an effective communicator and speaker, and we still talk about your presentation, and we'd love to have you back. And what I find really interesting is that writing the allergen is like a very easy thing, but the approach that the FDA had so far on insects is as a pest or an undesirable food. And so they say, oh, you can have 60 bits of insect parts in your chocolate, or in your coffee, you can have this much in candy and flour and all sorts of food. You can have these insects, but it's undesirable.
mm,
And then when you take a look at their code, they also state that if something is reared for the purpose of human consumption and processed at an FDA-approved facility and has a scientific name written on it, it is deemed as food.
mm.
But that silence and implicity of them to not state that insects can be used as food, and that these are the guidelines that do dictate that they are food safe for human consumption, is deafening. And so that is my big topic for my next presentation there, is like, thank you. We don't need you just to be silent in your approach. Whatever science that you need to approve this, and we're going through the GRAS process, the generally food accepted as safe. We're going through the process right now, but it's almost all hands on deck right now. That's why I love the interdisciplinary approach that we've had, and it's like really vital, because a lot of times people think, oh, this is just for the entomology department or food
Mm.
department. I'm like, no, quite on the contrary. And something that I get in really heated debates about with the STEM community is STEAM. And I know you would really get a kick out of this, Barrett, because I go into big STEM like groups where everyone's a scientist except for me, basically. And I'm like, all this science that you're doing is great, guys. I embrace it. I applaud it. The work that you're doing validates what I am doing, and I love to amplify the work that you're doing through the prism of liberal arts. And if you do not embrace the liberal and fine arts to help translate your genius science to make it more approachable for everyday people, you're going to be speaking inside a vacuum. And we can accelerate through our cooperation and partnership to reach a far greater audience when you're able to put that A in STEM. And so people, they definitely have choice words for me when I express my sentiments to them. And I'm happy to always have this debate. And I think it's even more important to be able to go where people disagree with me in order for me to share these ideas. And it's not with hostility or trying to, get into something, but it's like the sharing of ideas respectfully to be able to have a debate, I think is like more important than ever, especially today when we see all this divisiveness and all this like separation and canceling just because someone disagrees with you. And I wholeheartedly disagree with that practice as well.
So you talked about one audience that seemed to be, at least in the context of your presentation, converted, or at least curious. And I'm curious about other audiences. So for example, the stigmas in especially Western Hemisphere associated with eating insects, including indigenous practices, which have exist in pockets, have largely vanished in areas due to colonialism, in part. We can extend to negative associations with insects. Say, for example, you were to speak to farmers. Insects are often associated with crop destruction or food spoilage. What approach would you take with them? And how does your message fall on different audiences' ears?
Barrett, one, I have to applaud you because when people ask to interview me and they're like, "Oh, it'll only take 30 minutes," I kind of giggle to myself, and I love that. I love, and usually they're like, "Oh, right," and so I love that you were like, "Hey, let's put 90 minutes in the book because this may only be question number
That's right.
two."
That's right. We're not going to get through everything. We're just going to skim the surface, Joseph.
But I really appreciate just because the questions that you ask can literally be a topic for like a really long, engaging thing, and I'll try to unpack it as succinctly as possible for being the long-winded man that I am. So, okay, one, I'll go with the idea of like, okay, other people's reactions and also the message for farmers and such. So I'll start with the farmers first because I think that's a relatively shorter answer because the narratives of the experiences of sharing my work really globally amongst like academia in the public, at museums, at music festivals. It's really expansive. And so I'll start first with the farmers. And I think that it goes with sort of NASA's message. And NASA's message is space is for everybody. A lot of times people think it's like this exclusive thing for like physicists and like engineers and all these like super smart people, but NASA's message is quite simple. Space is for everybody. And I'm very honored to be the culinary advisor to the Methuselah Foundation in support of NASA's Deep Space Food Challenge. And part of the big idea of spaces for everyone is that when people are like, "Oh, this space race for billionaires, we're wasting all this money and resources for space," and I'm like, the reason why someone like me is interested, besides being a sci-fi geek and loving like space and everything, but on a work sense of when I deal with food security and sustainability, is the terrestrial applications of space technology to impact the Earth. And so we can take this technology for deep space travel and creating regenerative circular ag systems for deep space travel and apply it to food systems on Earth and be able to go, okay, there are natural disasters, there are areas with like less resources. What kind of technology can we apply to be able to help these areas in need? So to the farmers that are out there, what kind of technology can we learn and apply through the usage of insect agriculture to positively impact your food system.
Mm.
And so there's so many tremendous examples. And Marcel Dick from Wageningen University, he took, there was this area in I believe Kenya that was being infested by insects, and instead of using pesticides, he amazingly brought in another insect that wouldn't ruin the ecosystem, but still be the predator and take care of that pest solution for the crop. And then they would just live harmoniously in the ecosystem until that need arose again. And so we have solutions. And when we take a look at the regenerative circular nature of insect agriculture, of being able to take food waste, instead of having all this food waste in from your farms and that might go to landfills. I mean, 30% of our food is being wasted, going straight to landfills right now and not being fed to the masses. I mean, that's a whole entirely different problem. And when we also take a look at restaurant scraps and breweries and bakeries, we're able to feed them to black soldier fly larvae. They're able to exponentially grow eating this food waste and eat all this food waste with emitting like a negligible amount of methane. So one, we're able to like reduce the waste in our landfills and do so without emitting all the greenhouse gases and methane gases. But we've also passed legislation in both America and Europe and in Australia for chickens to be able to feed the black soldier fly larvae for animal feed, for bovine, for chicken, for aquaculture, and for pet food. And what we're realizing is that animal health is improving. There's also some white papers out that feeding black soldier fly larvae to bovine will reduce their methane gases. But what we've also realized is that this process of feeding them, the larvae fed on the food waste, we are then also decreasing deforestation in the Amazon for animal feed. When so much of our agricultural land is grown for the specific purpose of livestock feed or pet food, we are also helping to mitigate that. Now, as you probably know as an entomologist, Barrett, a byproduct of rearing the husbandry of metric tons of all these insects will be grass. And for those that don't know, that's quite simply the poop. And also, we also include the exuviae or the exoskeleton inside of the frass. And what we've realized is that it is an incredibly efficient bioorganic fertilizer, mitigating the chemicals in our waste streams from traditional fertilizers. But this is a really big gold star. It's also replenishing the soil health. And this is a really big issue because we're seeing all this soil health, the depletion from a lot of the monocrop agriculture or practices that we've had. And so to be able to have this regenerative circular ag system to improve soil health on top of everything else in this like food system, it's been really amazing to share the innovation and the potential of insect agriculture, not just for human consumption or for animal feed, for soil health, organic waste management, all like fertilizers, to be able to tackle so many of these incredible necessities in our global food systems. Like that is a great, incredible joy for me to share with farmers.
Thank you. Industrial insect farming is cropping up all over the world. So, for example, Brian Fisher has helped institute a facility in Madagascar, and there are places in Europe and in the Western Hemisphere. Is there one that pops out as, in these early days, the most successful in your mind? And in part, and I can say in part, not only in achieving set goals, but in the vein of sustainability, also thinking about the potential and the realized potential of using the frass and exuvie for fertilizer, for example? Or is this a larger aim in the near future?
Well, I would say that it is really incredible to consider that we have two companies that have raised over $500 million. We have a handful of companies that have raised over $100 million, and dozens who have raised over $10 million in the area of insect agriculture. So when I see this level of growth and interest, I think it's really fascinating to see the industry's growth like this. But again, one of the things that I have to emphasize is that when I go and speak with these companies or with these trade associations, we have to create a seat at the table for the small farmers and stakeholders and the smaller groups that have been working in this practice. And for our business to succeed, you can't just like put the big guys at the head of the table and ignore all the smaller stakeholders. And this is very much a really big part of what I feel as a chef advocate for IFAD, it's a UN agency, International Fund for Agricultural Development. Their emphasis on small farmers and stakeholders and providing the resources to the areas that are most underserved and in greatest need. And when I have the great honor to be able to work with institutions of that nature, I can't help but implement their philosophy because it is so important. I think that if we only focus on these large $100+ million companies, who I applaud and I love that they're so successful, but it would behoove me not to emphasize a great need for us to also put a great emphasis in the small farmers and stakeholders that will be the really a big part of like how we're able to succeed and really continue as a viable and really empathetic industry.
I like you've eased us into the positive aspects promoting the consumption of insects and arachnids. And we've touched on sustainability issues. You've hinted at nutrition, and we can talk about that more later. And you've also begun to address the idea of control of organisms. So, for example, if locusts swarm and take over, you can use them as a crop, right, as a surrogate crop. And some have used in Thailand weaver ants as a source of food, but also recognizing that they're predators of crop destroyers, right? And question popped to my head. I spent some time doing insect research in upstate New York this summer, and traveling back, especially through Pennsylvania, the spotted lanternfly was everywhere. Now, here's an example of an invasive species that is going, at least now, unchecked. So the numbers are extreme and unmanageable. But they're brightly colored, aposematic colored, red, white. Is there any way, or how careful do we need to be in selecting organisms in this context as a food resource?
Okay, the narratives of experiences of sharing food this with other people and institutions is something. Let's bookmark that. I definitely want to go back to that question. Control of organisms, and that's a really great question. And one of the things that I think is like vital and really important for the success of insect agriculture and edible insects is the rearing and husbandry of insects as a food source for us to be able to responsibly scale it and be able to put the regulatory measures to make sure that it's food safe and like for human beings, even or for animals. Without that, if people are just going out on the street and going like, oh, let's eat this. I heard you could eat this cricket, and their neighbor's been like spraying their entire backyard full of pesticides and they get sick or something. I mean, not to mention that so much of our food and crops are already being sprayed with horrific pesticides. Um, there's an issue with that. And when we had the massive locust swarms in Africa and Asia a couple of years ago, and I was like, is there a way that we can combat this and be able to, and I joke with Arnold Van Hout because he was working with the UN and trying to think about the best ways to mitigate this issue. And I was like, can't we just? And I was being kind of flippant about this. So I was like, Arnold, can't we just get a big net and collect them and eat them? And he kind of looked at me, I don't know if he knew I was just kind of joking, but
Yeah.
also real and joking. He's like, Joseph, I don't know if you know the swarm is like the size of the Netherlands or New Jersey. And I was like, wow,
As you
that
said,
it that
a really, really big net.
yeah, right. Yeah. Well, and so because of the pesticides that they are already using for management, because of all these, how do we know like what is safe to eat and not safe to eat? I was at the Science Summit for the UN General Assembly last week, and it's still happening right now. And I sadly missed a lot of it because of my head cold right now. I didn't want to risk people because of my own selfish desire to attend.
Well, thank you for me and us.
Yeah, right. Okay, yeah. Um, and I was on the rooftop of the opening plenary for the Science Summit, and there are all these like high-level diplomats and scientists there from around the world. And what was I doing on the rooftop? Stepping on spotted lanternflies. Because the USDA has a kill on site order for citizens in New York, in the area. And like I just had to have faith that I was gonna stop them all and educate them, tell them what I was doing, because and I was like, no, these diplomats don't need me to stop them and tell them about this. They seem way too occupied to go to where they were gonna go. I mean, some people they look up, they're like, hi, then I'll talk to them. But and so I was just like, I just have to do what I believe to be right. And I think ultimately it's a challenge. If when I was out in the Amazon earlier this year, we were taking insects from the wild and not worrying about any contaminants because they don't use any pesticides. So I was fine to eat those. And when I'm in other areas where I know that it's safe, like when I was collecting cicadas, I'm happy to take a different approach when I use the best sort of resources and knowledge to know that I'm conducting the best practices to collect them. Um, I had a friend who ate a spotted lanternfly nymph for me because I was because they apparently eat as an adult. They eat something that's quite noxious, and so and they also secrete some kind of chemical that makes them distasteful, which is why the predators aren't eating them right now. And so, are they good for human consumption? I think that's a no. However, what about the nymphs before they reach that stage in their instar? And so I had a scientist actually eat one, take a video. She's like, Joseph, this is for you. And she ate it. And, it was a pretty benign response to just eating a small, tiny little spotted lanternfly nymph. And maybe that's something, but I think we need to think about this in a larger practice. I think we need to think of a better solution than asking citizens to stomp on them because it hurts my heart because they're so beautiful and I'm literally stomping on them. Evolutionary thing that's been happening over just the past 2 years, Barrett, which you may find interesting. When I first started seeing them, I'll go, oh, kind of cute. Splat. Dead. Now, when I try to step on them, they fly away much faster. And so now they've already, and it's like, I guess they're adapting and the stronger will survive. And they're already flying incredibly faster than than when I first saw them a couple of years ago. And so they're already adapting, and they're a lot more challenging to kill now. Whereas the first year, literally slow, giant step, stomp. Now, if you're not quick, you won't even catch them.
So with evolution by means of natural selection, Joseph Yoon is a selective agent.
I am among them,
Your
and you know,
shoe is a selective.
but you know, it's like it's so important though to think about, you know, can we create food systems that allow for us for the control of organisms
Mhm.
that we can then add to our food supply chain. That'll be a responsible way to do this. That's a very difficult question because of all the factors that lead up to the next factor, and things that are entirely out of our control that we have no knowledge of, that can have a great impact. And so there are challenges. I think that, you know, it would be wonderful to think if we can be able to address this on a far larger and global scale, to be able to go like, hey, here's this food source. One of the big things that I'm working on right now is USAID, create an insect protein working group. USDA has been showing a greater interest in insects for in agricultural practices, and we're seeing more um, support around insect agriculture. And with that issue of globalization that I addressed earlier, I want to be able to create a global awareness campaign that will allow for people to like reclaim this as a proud heritage, as a part of their heritage, and to be able to like really think on global terms, similar to Got Milk, and like how that really transformed the way that the dairy industry and USDA cooperated to be able to change awareness. And that's a similar sort of campaign that I'm actively working on, so that we can like have this be more accepted, and for people to be proud of this sort of practice.
Let's touch on idea of honoring cultural traditions and
Mhm.
connecting with the topic of indigenous reclamation, for example. Um, a recent study conservatively estimated that 1,611 insects proper are eaten or have traditionally been eaten.
Wait,
And
how many?
1,611, but they make the caveat that this is an extreme underestimate. It's only a very conservative check on an academically or scholarly popular database that would number over 2,000. Now, you and
I was
I,
going to say, because the numbers I've seen have been over 2,000.
oh yeah, and
Yeah.
that's typically what's cited. This was just a conservative estimate that went through and tried to make the a meticulous check on each source. And when they couldn't confirm it, they just set that
Put the
aside,
conservative number. Yeah.
knowing full well that the number is much higher. So with these numbers, a good example would be like 61 species of termites, mostly in the genus Macrotermes, are eaten. So we can think about
Amazing.
the diversity is insane. I mean, if we think about insects, period, there are well over 1,100,000 described species, with estimates, depending on with whom you speak, 8 million, 10 million, 30 million. We really don't even know, even to order of magnitude, how many species of insects exist on the planet. So later, I would love to talk with you about choice insect lineages and groups. But for now, I wanted to address the idea of honoring cultural traditions. And so is it the mopane worm in parts of Africa? Is it the witchetty grub for Aboriginal Australians? Is it the, fill in the blank, wherever you are in the world? I'd love for you to talk in terms of, as an ambassador of entomophagy, that aspect of eating insects and the promotion of eating insects.
Yeah, I think that this is something that's really um, important to me, and something that I have to I have to be able to experience and have a heart of learning and curiosity for me to be effective at what I do. And the reason being is that it's so incredible for me to travel for now 1/3 of this year, now that the world is open, and I'm given this incredible opportunity to share my work as this as like a global sort of thought leader in this practice. And so if I could not even remotely possibly imagine going without making more time to learn and spend time with not just indigenous, but like local people, right?
Mhm.
Because depending on what area of the world I'm going, and so in Ecuador, I did work with a lot of different, a lot of indigenous groups, but also there are people there that are Ecuadorian that have lived there for centuries, their family for centuries, that I also have a keen interest in learning from. And I think that this insatiable curiosity and forever being a student, and for me to be viewed in a way where they give me the opportunity to speak and give me a really big platform to share my work. I love to be able to go and literally go with big eyes and the desire to learn and have a cultural exchange. Yes, I am more than happy to teach what I humbly know through my experiences. And also, it's vital for me to engage with local people, because imagine if I just went to Thailand and ate insects wherever I could. And I was just like, oh, yeah, great. People here eat insects. And I totally missed having the conversation with people on the street, at the universities, students, academics, scientists, all layers of the population. I would have missed this, like what's really happening. Because like so far I hear everyone that goes to Thailand, oh yeah, they love eating insects in Thailand. Like that's the general thread that I hear. And indeed, that is not what's really happening, from at least from my 2 weeks of being in Thailand.
Mhm.
And they're like, in the northeastern region, there's an area where they eat a lot more. But yeah, that's the other people. That's them over there. And so for me, I think that it's so important. And when we take a look at when people are like, oh, Americans or Westerners don't eat insects. And I remember I said that once. It was the last time I said it. Like, Westerners don't eat insects. And Florence Dunkel was like, Joseph, you have to say Anglo-Westerners because Native Americans are eating insects and they're from, and so yeah. And I was like, Florence, you're so right. Thank you for correcting me. And since then, I've always been very mindful in that. And I think that there's a lot of great challenges in how we approach these sort of really triggered topics of indigenous reclamation, and also in even like colonialism, because I see some people like react like just physically when they hear that term, because I don't know if it's a sense of guilt that they have, or that it's like this woke ideology that makes them feel defensive, or if it's something they want to learn and be a part of finding solutions. But these are incredibly challenging ideas of humanity that we're trying to unpack. And it's been fascinating to be able to approach this through the prism and practice of eating insects as a way to unpack and discover how can we be better humans. And so I love that a lot of areas that I go to where people may be very triggered by the practice that I do, and they might be very aggressive against me. That I can genuinely extend kindness as a way to be able to approach their hostility. And I don't know if this is a good segue for us to discuss some of the experiences I have, or if we want to talk a little bit more about honoring cultural traditions.
A great segue to what is probably top of the list. I mean, you've talked about cultural traditions, sustainability, a hint of nutrition advantages, uh, crop destruction, use of insects that are deemed undesirable under certain conditions. But what about tastiness and novelty factor? So the motto for Brooklyn Bugs is feed your curiosity, right? So if we're to invite as an ambassador, if you're to there we go.
Yeah.
If you're to invite or attract this otherwise very common pursuit in different cultures to those resistant or ignorant of the practice who aren't allergic or for other reasons going to reject the consumption of insects and arachnids. What is it about novelty and the fun and the tastiness that will pave the path? People have written about how it's not any of these other things that are going to change people's minds. It's about whether or not it's fun and tasty.
Yeah. So we will never find a substitute for something that will, with success, that is not equal to or better than what it's substituting, right? If we have,
Can I
yes,
interject and ask you, have you tried the Impossible Burger? And
yes, of course.
I know this is a sidetrack, tangent,
Yeah.
but thoughts there in this context?
Yeah, I love what the Impossible Burger and Beyond Burger have done to open the marketing ideas, because a lot of the language I use is exactly the language that my industry needs to use to open up these pathways. And so we're going to set aside all the extra additives and everything that are added to these burgers and their, whether they're indeed their sustainability and all that stuff, like that, all that aside. But regarding the actual flavor and also regarding their efficiency in marketing and all that, I think it's been really really great. And so when we, it's like, okay, so they're a great example of like, we're gonna try to replace this burger, and it has to be equivalent or better for people, like, because I think that's why a lot of like the veggie burgers of past, they didn't not catch on, because they were something entirely different. And so what I think is like been really paramount to, and it's not that they will never substitute it, it'll take a far longer time to convince people if it's not going to be as good, and you got just like through attrition. But instead, if you create a product that's like equal or better, then it's going to be then it'll have a greater trajectory for success. So what one thing, and this could be a very brief thing, but just to address the nutrition real quickly. On the nutritional side of things, edible insects by weight, I mean, as we said, there are over 1,600, or some accounts over 2,000 species. And so each of them have like wildly different nutritional values based on like what they're fed, how they're reared, how they're ultimately processed. So there are a lot of factors, but in general, we found that like edible insects are 50 to 80% protein by weight. If we take crickets as one example of an insect, they have all 9 essential amino acids, which are the building blocks that our bodies don't naturally produce, that we need to consume somehow. And so the fact that they are so high in protein, have all 9 essential amino acids, have other micronutrients like B12 and zinc, and and the fact that they also have chitin, which is, as we do more research, is showing that it's really good for your prebiotic gut health. We have all these positive nutritional benefits of eating insects. And so the fact that it's nutritious and sustainable, those are the two big factors that I feel scientists have put into the practice of eating insects. They're like sustainable, nutrient dense, we should be eating insects. And what I realized is that we will not create behavioral change by stating scientific facts of what to eat because it's sustainable or nutritious. I mean, that maybe they'll reach a small demographic, 10% of people will be like, okay, I'll be willing to try this because it's sustainable and stuff. And so from day one, and this is not a joke, Barrett, from day one of when I began not eating insects, because I've been eating insects for a much longer time, but when I started cooking with insects, I knew immediately, how do I make this taste delicious?
Yeah.
And so for me, it was vital for me to have a functional understanding of insect protein, because when you take flour, for example, and then you bake it into bread or you turn it into a cake, the manner in which you cook it is going to really vary the flavor profile, the sensory of like its texture. But then also just say that you bake it into bread and then you have a piece of bread, soft and squishy, maybe hard crust on the outside, and then you toast it, then it becomes hard. Taste changes, you grill it with some butter, you bake it in the oven. All of these factors will have a tremendously different impact. Really, the gastronomical applications of like how we prepare food are going to dramatically alter the flavor and the texture and the whole manner in which we will ingest and appreciate the food, experience of food. So I was like, okay, I need to exhaustively work on the culinary applications and have a better functional understanding of what this food is when it's boiled or fried or fermented or baked or, like through and all the manners and machinations culinarily. And so I essentially tried to do that with every single insect that I would receive, to put it through a very methodical practice, have an understanding of the food, and then to be able to apply it into manners that I think would be more applicable for human consumption.
Mm-hmm.
And I look back on my growth of cooking with insects now for 6 years, and to be quite honest with you, I'm a little embarrassed by preliminary my preliminary workings. When I look back on it, I'm like, oh gosh, I would never do that now. And primarily because I didn't know where I was going to go with cooking bugs. I just like took the dive, and it was literally like leaping into a wormhole and just like, wow, I am literally going through like a metamorphosis, Barrett. It's been really just fascinating to change so much in my life because of my work around eating insects. And what I realized is that as I began working with insects, I was like, all right, you guys, and this is when I was cooking for a lot of one percenters and some celebrities and such, and as a private chef in New York, and for these for these big companies and such. And so I was like, okay, you guys don't want to eat insects, but what if I were to put it on a lump of caviar? Or what if I were to use like Wagyu beef, or put like just like really expensive food and pair insects with that as a way to tantalize you to try eating a scorpion or a vespula, flavosap, or and I'm glad I did that, because that was what I thought would be a pathway for me to be able to share this. And I made vegetarian dishes as well with insects, because I didn't want vegetarian to not be able to eat at my events, but I certainly had like really premium ingredients that I utilized to share this food. And what I realized now, I look back on that, I'm like, I would never do that. Like, I would never serve my insects with like beef anymore. I mean, that's just not like I want everyone to be able to eat. If anyone wants to eat the food that I prepare and they're vegetarian as like the baseline, I want every single person to be able to eat it. Not like, oh, I would love to try these insects, but it's like cricket crust with fried chicken. I don't eat chicken. And so that's when I was like, okay. And I'm so happy that it was actually after a couple years of doing that, I, I dramatically started decreasing my meat consumption. I'm so happy because as I just began to learn more, I was like, okay, I can decrease my carbon footprint the most, not by stopping driving my car, which was mind blowing to me, but by substituting all the meat I've been eating. And I've amazingly now, for almost 3 years, have largely not cooked any meat in my apartment outside of insects.
Hmm.
And I get takeout. I still eat as an omnivore, but I'm not buying raw meat, and so I'll buy takeout and sometimes some prepared dumplings because it's a guilty pleasure of mine.
So now, since we're in Joseph Yoon's kitchen, we're getting personal here. Kimchi, bibimbap. How does the insect infusion affect a diet that you have grown to love that may not have included insects initially?
Yes. Let me. I would love to get to that. Let me just finish the
Sure,
evolution
please.
of my culinary real quick. But I took a note of that so we can. I actually have a lot of notes of things we have to. This may be an 8-hour interview.
Part
Um,
one of 37.